For nearly 3 decades after the guns of World War II fell silent, deep in the dense, unforgiving jungles of the Philippines, one man continued to fight a war that had long ended. The world had changed. Cities rebuilt, enemies reconciled, nations rose from ashes. But for this lone soldier, the Empire of Japan was still at war. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and his story is one of unwavering duty, unimaginable isolation, and a loyalty that blurred the line between devotion and delusion. It all began in the final desperate years of the Second World War, 1944. Japan was losing ground fast. The Allies were closing in on the Pacific Islands one by one, and the Imperial Japanese Army was running out of options. Onoda, then a 22-year-old intelligence officer, was trained in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and survival tactics. He was not just another soldier. He was one of the elite, trained to live off the land, to fight without supply lines, and to survive even if the rest of Japan fell. His orders were simple yet absolute. You are to carry on the mission, even if Japan surrenders. Never give up. Those words would become the chain that bound him for nearly 30 years. When Onoda was sent to the small Philippine island of Lubang in December 1944, his mission was to disrupt Allied operations, destroy airstrips, cut communication lines, and gather intelligence. He was joined by a handful of other soldiers. But as the months passed, the war turned against him faster than anyone could have predicted. The Americans landed. Fierce battles erupted, and soon the Japanese forces on Lubang were either killed, captured, or forced into hiding. Then, in August 1945, the unthinkable happened. Japan surrendered. The emperor himself spoke over the radio, his voice trembling with resignation. The war was over. But in the thick jungles of Lubang, Onoda never heard that voice. At first, leaflets began falling from the sky. They fluttered down to the trees, carried by the wind, printed in Japanese, announcing the end of the war. The men found them. But Onoda, the loyal intelligence officer, refused to believe. To him, it was an Allied trick, propaganda meant to lure them out. He told his men, if the war was really over, the emperor would never surrender like this. This is fake. So they stayed hidden. Days became weeks, weeks turned to months, and the months became years. They built shelters deep in the forest, hunted cows for food, and avoided every sign of human activity. To them, the war was still going on. Every gunshot in the distance, every villager carrying a machete, every plane flying overhead, all of it was seen as proof that the fight continued. In their minds, Japan would return one day. Reinforcements would come. They just had to keep fighting until that moment arrived. As time went on, the small group of soldiers began to shrink. Some were killed in skirmishes with local police, others surrendered, and a few simply vanished into the forest. But Onoda remained steadfast. He believed that his orders were sacred, and surrender was dishonor. Imagine the world transforming outside that jungle. Jet planes crossed oceans. Men walked on the moon. Empires collapsed, and new ones rose. Yet in that forgotten corner of the Philippines, one man lived as if it was still 1945, hunting, hiding, surviving. The villagers on Lubang came to know them. The Japanese ghosts, they were called. The locals feared venturing too deep into the forest, for Onoda and his remaining comrades sometimes raided the farms for food. They would kill cattle, steal rice, and vanish before dawn. To the villagers, these men were remnants of a haunting past, phantoms of a war that refused to die. Years turned into decades. Leaflets were dropped again. Newspapers, photographs, even family letters. Onoda saw them all, but he thought every single one was fake. Even a letter from his own brother, urging him to come home, was dismissed as enemy trickery. To survive, he relied on instinct. He repaired his uniform again and again until it was more patched than fabric. His rifle, still polished, never left his side. The jungle became his world, its sounds, its rhythms, its dangers, all of it part of his reality. He grew lean, alert, and unyielding. Every rustle of leaves could mean danger. Every footprint could be an enemy. He had lived this way for so long that it became not just a duty, it became his identity. Meanwhile, back in Japan, life had moved on. The once proud empire had rebuilt itself into a modern, peaceful nation. Tokyo was now a glittering city of neon lights and bullet trains. But few knew or cared that somewhere a soldier still waited for orders that would never come. Then came the 1950s. By now, many of the holdouts, Japanese soldiers who refused to believe the war was over, had been found across the Pacific Islands. Some surrendered when they saw undeniable proof of peace. Others were captured, broken by time and solitude. But not Onoda. His training had been too thorough, his loyalty too absolute. When other men gave up, he dug deeper. In 1954, the last of his comrades, Private Shimada, was killed during a shootout with local police. Onoda buried him with military honors, alone in the jungle. Now there were only two, Onoda and a soldier named Kenshichi Kozuka. Together, they continued their mission, carrying out small raids on villages and burning harvested rice fields to disrupt enemy operations. They genuinely believed they were still serving the emperor. Decades had passed. The world's eyes turned to new conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War. But Onoda's private war never ended. And then, one by one, even his last companions fell away. Kozuka was shot dead in 1972 by local authorities during yet another raid. Onoda was now the last one left. 29 years had passed since World War II ended. And somewhere in that overgrown, insect-infested jungle, a man in a tattered uniform still stood guard, rifle in hand, eyes sharp, heart loyal. He was waiting for one thing, for someone, anyone, to give him the order to stand down. He would not surrender until that moment came. By 1972, almost 3 decades after the end of World War II, Hiroo Onoda had become a legend whispered about in the Philippines. Part ghost story, part mystery. Locals spoke of a Japanese soldier living alone in the jungle, who attacked farmers and vanished into the trees like a spirit. Few believed he could still be alive. But when police shot and killed a man identified as Kozuka, wearing a decayed Japanese uniform and carrying an old rifle, the world realized the stories were true. There was still one man out there, one last soldier of the empire. News spread like wildfire. A man had survived nearly 30 years in the jungle, convinced that World War II had never ended. Journalists flooded Lubon Island. Japanese officials were stunned, embarrassed, even fascinated. How could a soldier remain hidden for so long? How could he still be fighting a war that the rest of the world had forgotten? To understand Onoda, one must understand the spirit that shaped him. The code of Bushido, the ancient samurai principle of honor and loyalty. In Imperial Japan, soldiers were taught that surrender was worse than death. It was not simply defeat. It was disgrace to the emperor and the nation. Every soldier was expected to fight to the end, even if all hope was lost. That mentality, drilled into Onoda during his training, had become the foundation of his existence. He believed, truly and absolutely, that Japan could never surrender. When leaflets and letters told him otherwise, his mind rejected them. It was easier and more honorable to believe they were lies. But by the early 1970s, time itself had turned him into an anachronism, a man from another century, frozen in a war no one else remembered. And then, fate intervened. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio, Suzuki set out on a journey across the world. He told friends he wanted to find 3 things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Onoda. When he arrived in the Philippines and hiked into the jungle, no one took him seriously. Yet, against all odds, he succeeded where everyone else had failed. Suzuki wandered deep into the forest, calling out in Japanese, "Ono-san, the emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." And then one day, Onoda appeared, cautious, armed, and suspicious. His uniform, though worn and faded, was clean and meticulously kept. His rifle gleamed with care. Suzuki couldn't believe his eyes. It was like seeing a ghost step out of time. He told Onoda the war was over, that Japan had been at peace for decades. But Onoda only shook his head. He said he could not surrender without orders from his commanding officer. It was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. Even after 29 years, Onoda was still an officer following his chain of command. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs and proof. The government was astonished. After all this time, Onoda was alive, still following orders that no longer existed. But how could they convince him it was truly over? There was only one way. They had to find his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had given Onoda his orders in 1944. Taniguchi, now an elderly man working in a bookstore, was shocked to learn his former soldier was still waiting in the jungle. When the government asked him to return to Lubang, he agreed. In March 1974, the world watched in anticipation as Taniguchi flew to the Philippines. Reporters and soldiers stood by as he entered the jungle, carrying the formal documents to relieve Onoda duty. When Onoda saw his former commander, he snapped to attention, saluted sharply, and awaited orders, just as he had nearly 30 years before. Taniguchi looked at him and said quietly, "Lieutenant Onoda, the war is over. You are relieved of your duties." For the first time in decades, Onoda's world shattered. The war that had defined his entire existence, his reason for living, was gone. Slowly, he removed his rifle, his sword, his ammunition, and handed them over. Then, with trembling hands, he saluted one last time. He had finally surrendered. When he emerged from the jungle in full uniform, sword aside, rifle still working, and his old imperial cap proudly on his head, crowds gasped. Cameras flashed. Here was a man who had refused to let go of the past, a living artifact of the Second World War, preserved by loyalty and isolation. And yet, his surrender was not one of defeat. He walked out tall, proud, and calm. His uniform was spotless. His rifle was clean. He looked more like a soldier returning from patrol than a man who had missed 3 decades of history. When he reached the city, Japanese officials read him a formal statement of pardon from the Philippine President, Ferdinand Marcos. Although Onoda's actions had caused deaths and destruction over the years, Marcos forgave him, saying he had acted under the belief that he was still at war. The Japanese public was both awed and conflicted. Some hailed him as a hero of loyalty, the embodiment of devotion to duty. Others pitted him, seeing his story as a tragedy of blind obedience. But Onoda himself was calm. When reporters asked him if he regretted anything, he said, "I was faithful to my orders. That was my duty as a soldier." He had lived by those words for 29 years, longer than most men's entire careers. After returning to Japan, Onoda was struck by the modern world. The Tokyo he had known in 1944 was gone, replaced by a skyline of skyscrapers, neon lights, and endless traffic. Japan had transformed into a peaceful economic giant. He struggled to adapt. The noise, the crowds, the rush. It was overwhelming for a man who had lived half his life listening only to the sounds of wind, rain, and birds. In interviews, he admitted feeling like a stranger in his own country. He couldn't understand the youth, their fashion, their music, their attitudes. He once said, "The Japan I fought for no longer exists." Interesting details emerged over time about how he had survived. He had maintained his rifle and equipment meticulously. His uniform had been repaired countless times using vines and plant fibers. He had lived off coconuts, bananas, and stolen cattle, and he had read and reread his training manual until it nearly disintegrated. He even wrote in his journal almost every day, documenting his mission progress. Those notebooks later revealed a mind trapped in an endless cycle of duty and survival, convinced that at any moment, Japan would return to reclaim the island. For 29 years, he slept on the ground, patched his uniform by candlelight, and stayed hidden from an entire world that had moved on without him. His surrender in 1974 was not just the end of his personal war. It was a symbolic closing chapter of World War II itself. But the story didn't end there, because after a brief period in Japan, Onoda made a surprising choice that stunned everyone again. He left his homeland, and where he went and what he did next revealed the kind of man he truly was. After nearly 3 decades of hiding in the jungle, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda finally returned home to Japan in 1974, a soldier from another era stepping into a future that had long forgotten him. When he arrived at the Tokyo airport, thousands gathered to witness him. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting, crowds waving Japanese flags. Some cried, some simply stared in disbelief. Here was a man who had stayed loyal longer than anyone thought humanly possible. But beneath the pride and applause, Onoda felt only confusion. Tokyo was unrecognizable. The streets blazed with neon lights. Cars rushed by in endless streams, and the people, dressed in suits and modern clothes, no longer looked like the nation he had once vowed to protect. He had left an empire at war. He had returned to a pacifist, industrialized world chasing prosperity instead of glory. He was 52 years old, but his eyes looked far older, hardened by the jungle, distant, cautious. When reporters asked him what he thought of the new Japan, his answer was quiet. Japan has changed too much. The Japan I fought for no longer exists. He was honored by the government, interviewed endlessly, and flooded with offers, book deals, TV appearances, speaking invitations. Yet, fame made him uneasy. He wasn't a hero to himself. He was a man who had simply followed orders. For him, loyalty wasn't a choice, it was duty. He met with his aging parents, who had long believed he was dead. They embraced him in tears, a reunion 3 decades in the making. To them, he was still their son, not the soldier the world had turned into a symbol. But adjusting to peace was far harder than surviving the jungle. The man who had lived by instinct and discipline now struggled to live by clocks and traffic lights. For years, every shadow, every sudden sound made him flinch. He found it difficult to trust the world around him. The endless noise of the city, the flashing lights, all of it felt like chaos compared to quiet order of the forest. He had spent 10,000 nights listening to nothing but rain, birds, and the hum of insects, and now he was surrounded by televisions, advertisements, and machines. The modern Japan he'd come home to was not built on the old code of Bushido. It was built on business, convenience, and speed. He tried to fit in. He published a memoir titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War, where he described in detail how he survived and why he refused to believe the war had ended. The book became a sensation, both fascinating and tragic, and soon Onoda was seen as the last true samurai of the 20th century. But inside, he felt increasingly alienated. Japan's youth saw him as a curiosity, a relic from a distant past. Many couldn't comprehend the kind of devotion that had kept him alive for so long. Others criticized him for the lives lost during his raids, even if he believed he was following orders. Haunted by the disconnect, Onoda made a decision that surprised everyone. In 1975, just 1 year after returning home, he left Japan and moved to Brazil. There, he bought a cattle ranch and began a quiet new life. The open fields and endless sky reminded him of the freedom he had once known, a kind of peace that didn't exist in the crowded streets of Tokyo. In Brazil, Onoda found a new purpose. He worked hard, raised cattle, and married a Japanese woman named Machi. Together, they built a simple, quiet life. But his discipline never left him. He woke at sunrise, worked methodically, and treated his days with the same precision he once gave to his military duties. And yet, his past always lingered. Occasionally, journalists would find him, seeking interviews, asking him to revisit the story that had defined his life. But Onoda preferred silence. He would only smile politely and say, "There's nothing strange about being loyal to your orders." Still, Japan never forgot him. He had become a symbol of unwavering dedication, a man who lived by a promise, even when the entire world changed around him. For some, he was a hero of loyalty. For others, a tragic reminder of how blind obedience can trap a man in time. In 1984, after years in Brazil, Onoda returned to Japan once more, not to stay, but to give back. Shocked by how Japan's youth seemed aimless and detached, he founded the Onoda Nature School, an organization dedicated to teaching young people survival skills, resilience, and discipline. He wanted them to understand the strength that comes from purpose, the same strength that had kept him alive all those years. He taught them how to camp, build shelters, hunt, and endure hardship, lessons drawn straight from his life in the jungle. But more than that, he taught them something deeper, how to find conviction in a world that no longer valued it. Through the decades, Onoda became a living contradiction, a man revered for his devotion but also pitted for his lost years. He had lived longer in a world that no longer existed than in the one that did. He never expressed regret for following his orders, but he often reflected on the cost of those years. Men should never lose sight of their purpose, he once said, but they must also know when that purpose has ended. As he grew older, Onoda became quieter. He returned to Brazil once more, tending his ranch and keeping to himself. In 2014, at the age of 91, Hiroo Onoda passed away in Tokyo. Not as a soldier, not as a relic, but as a man who had lived by an unbreakable code. When news of his death spread, Japan mourned. To many, he symbolized the last link to an age of discipline and sacrifice that had long disappeared. For others, his story served as a haunting reminder of the cost of devotion and of how loyalty without question can turn into a prison. Even today, Onoda's name echoes through history as one of the most extraordinary stories of the 20th century. He survived almost 3 decades alone in the wilderness, not because he had to, but because he chose to obey a promise. He had faced hunger, disease, loneliness, and time itself, and he never surrendered. When he finally laid down his rifle, the world didn't just witness the end of the soldiers' war. It witnessed the end of an era, the final chapter of the Second World War written not in blood, but in patience, endurance, and unshakable faith. Hiroo Onoda was more than a man lost in time. He was a reflection of the human spirit, how it can cling to belief even when the world moves on, how duty can outlast reason, and how a single command can echo across 30 silent years. His life remains a question as much as it is a story. Was he a hero of loyalty or a prisoner of his own devotion? Perhaps, in the end, he was both. And somewhere in the quiet rustle of the Philippine jungle, the sound of rain on the leaves still seems to whisper his story. The story of the soldier who never surrendered,